Yes, today we have Paris. Thank you for being a guest today on my podcast.
Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, so first of all, could you introduce yourself? What's your name and what's your biggest interest in iOS?
Sure. My name is Paris Xavier Pinkney, and I've been a full stack iOS developer specifically for about, I want to say 10 years now. And right now I'm cross-platform for all Apple platforms, iOS, tvOS, iPadOS, macOS, and watchOS. And the thing in Swift and iOS development that I am passionate about the most is um, creating a safe and clean API. Anything that will allow next future developers, including myself, to kind of maintain their systems without having any weird side effects or runtime issues. So I definitely care about error handling and pushing things to the compiler rather than having surprises while your app is running.
Nice. So you have like a lot of very good. How do you particularly make sure your error handling is really good?
The Yeah, that's a good question. So the
Yeah.
first thing that I try to do is look into to see what the thing that you're actually building. So if you're making a class or a struct or some sort of type, um, what is the thing supposed to do? Is it an actual thing or is it doing something? And if it's a thing itself, I try to make it so that thing is composed by other actors that do things. And that helps for testing as well. So you can use protocols for this, but it also allows you to use things like generics. So um, I'd rather have, instead of having a notion of like a dog or a cat, I'd rather have a notion of some sort of running type or a fetching type. That way, any type that can fetch can do this thing and now has this functionality. Um, and we have sort of similar concepts in Ruby and Scala called mixins that are very similar to what Swift can do, where you take some sort of convention like a conformance, like a protocol, and you can add an extension onto it that says, when I'm conforming to this specific type, I have this functionality.
Right.
Um, so with Swift, we have
Yeah.
sequence types and collection types that have that sort of behavior that allows you to have flat map and filter.
Nice. Awesome.
Yeah.
So basically you don't force unwrap, do you?
Sometimes you need
Oh, for some
to.
time.
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
sometimes. Yeah, so with generics in particular, when you get into very low level generics, you may need to force and wrap
See, okay.
when you're using these protocol systems because
Okay.
the compiler doesn't necessarily know what type you need from the generics. It only knows that it's a protocol. So it knows that it's a collection of some type, but it doesn't know that it's an array.
Right. Right.
It
Oh,
may be
wow.
a dictionary. So those
Exactly.
are or it may be a set. So it doesn't know exactly what the concrete type is. So if you definitely need an array, you may have to force unwrap.
Nice. So
Yeah.
you said you've been developing for 10 years now. And so what got your first interest into iOS? I was like, what makes you decide that, hey, I want to do this for sure?
Yeah. That's a great question too. So I spent most of my career now as a designer. So I started off as graphic design and I did that for about 15 years. I started designing in middle school and I did it professionally uh, part way through high school and into university.
Gotcha.
Um, and so my first design role outside of college was back home here in Oakland. Um, and it was for a startup in the financial industry in fintech. And I got to the point where I was designing their iOS application. Something that I was fascinated with was doing production design for iOS specifically.
Mhm.
'Cause Apple is very known for their design and their aesthetics. So um, I ended up designing the prototype for a few of our internal apps at that company, and then was given the opportunity to build them myself.
Were you using Sketch at that time or?
No, Sketch didn't exist at that time. So it was I was using um, Illustrator, and then we used Framer JS, and then we also used Keynote. So Apple Keynote was a very huge tool for prototyping apps back then,
Oh, wow.
and still today, you can still use that today.
Oh, wow. I'm gonna look into that.
Yeah. So the same animations that happen on iOS natively are also in Keynote, so you could do the transitions very easily.
Nice, nice. Yeah,
Yeah,
definitely look into that for sure.
yeah,
And yeah, so like, could you tell me about? So you studied for design, and that makes sense because Apple like text typography and all the colors and putting everything together. Really like they really care about their users
right.
very much, and then they go backwards into the engineering. So is that the same approach you have as well?
Yeah, so it was a good, I guess, like in your tool belt, I guess if you use that analogy, it was a good tool to have is to have a design background. So
Right.
um, every product manager, I guess, wants to have a very experienced technical engineer, but also a very experienced aesthetic engineer that has like the front end
Mhm.
behaviors and those rules and mindsets. So
Right.
having someone that can do both
Yeah.
on the product is very valuable because you know how to make people use your tool or use your product, but you
Mhm.
also know the complexities of doing that thing that looks really cool and if it's really needed versus if you want to get something out really quickly.
Right.
The things that you can implement today and then improve later on are more easier to identify, I guess.
Right.
Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, I'll definitely, explore it as well. Designing. Yeah, nice. And yeah, so what would you say are your biggest challenges getting started?
Oh yes, my biggest challenge was actually learning for number one. So I learned with Objective C. I was Objective C 1.0 at the time. I came in right with the 2.0 transition. So um,
Oh,
yeah, it was a while ago.
yes.
Not too much time in development life, but in the iOS world, it was a long time ago. So the hardest thing was learning the memory management um, and blocks.
Right.
Not understanding how asynchronous code worked and things like retain cycles and things like that.
Mhm.
A lot of my first prototypes for that company had a lot of those issues, and
Gotcha.
I was the only one that actually knew Objective C at that time in my company. So
Gotcha.
had a lot of terms that were from JavaScript or Ruby or Java, and so
Right.
other engineers and other developers would use different terms for the same thing that I was using, but I didn't know what those meant. So I had
Right.
a lot of people telling me things, expecting me to understand what they were talking about, but I didn't know what those things were called in Objective C.
Right. Right.
So
And I'm
that caused
sure.
me to do a lot of research and do a lot of searching online.
Yeah. And was Stack Overflow around at the time or
Yeah,
no?
Stack Overflow was very
Yeah.
helpful.
Okay. Gotcha.
But using my peers, I think was the best if you had them, physically.
Nice. Yeah.
Stack Overflow was helpful. Twitter was also very helpful.
Nice. Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
I
That's my follow up. Did you have like a mentor or somebody guiding you getting started?
Yeah, so in the beginning, I actually went into San Francisco and met with a few experienced iOS developers and sat with them about making API calls and network requests and dealing with file management on the disk and what the best ways that they would do it and the best
Yeah.
libraries that they used.
Yes.
And then I slowly started learning um, how to do those things with the native framework rather than using those third party libraries,
Mhm.
which allowed me to then understand more about how the system should work and then start reading the documentation once I understood the concepts.
Right.
Getting the terminology, I think, was allowed me to look for the right documentation that I needed to find the next thing that I wanted to implement. But if you're not located in the Bay Area or in New York or any of those big tech places like Denver or Austin or Chicago even,
Right.
um, the Twitter community for iOS is definitely something unlike any other community out there in tech, I would say. Now that we have Slack as well, there's a lot of Slack groups out there for iOS in particular, where you can meet some of the best and the most inexperienced developers around the world that all have the same questions. So it's good to know that everyone's asking the exact same things.
Yep, I agree. And also meetups.
Yeah,
Meetups, going to meetups and meeting other iOS developers in your community. It helps a lot.
yeah,
Yeah, for
exactly.
sure. Yeah. Nice. And yeah, could you tell me a little bit about your personal projects that you made?
Yeah, so
I'm sure that helped you in your growing process, strengthening your skills.
definitely. In the
Yeah.
beginning, the first app that I built was an anonymous. I guess it was a like a therapy, sort of like a journaling app. So it was the intent of the app was to have any user pick up this app and write a journal that they could share, just like Twitter. You send out a tweet to the world, but no one could respond to it. They couldn't add a comment, but they could like it and save it for later.
Okay.
But
Uh,
they couldn't actually respond to you. So
I
the point
see.
was just for the user to be able to write a story, like a blog post.
Right.
And then once you enter that blog post, it would ask you how you're feeling, and you put a mood, and then that mood would basically turn into a cover image for your story.
Gotcha. Nice.
Yeah, so it was cool. It used a lot of, I learned a lot about the image IO framework and blurring things. This was before the blurring API came out in iOS 7. So this was in iOS 5. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, no, we were using NS-URL connection and those sorts of things. So I tried to use everything that I needed for my job in this side project.
Nice.
And then the second app was a quotes app, which was the first way for me to actually hit an API that
Mm.
wasn't something that I built myself.
Okay.
Um,
Nice.
so I used a open source quote API and basically took another API for images from, I think it was 500 pixels, and
Okay.
then downloaded those images and those quotes at the same time, and just
Yeah.
showed them every day with a push notification every morning at whatever time the user wanted. So I
Right.
learned those frameworks as well.
Yeah, and also compressing the images and
Exactly.
making sure that the right aspect fits and all that.
Hmm.
Nice. And also caching the images. So that's
Yeah, that
okay.
was something that took a while to learn, was
Yeah.
caching, client side caching, and then figuring out how to prevent server requests when you don't need to, and
Hmm.
also not sending duplicate notifications.
Right.
Uh, yeah,
Nice.
so it took a lot of research and searching, but um, I definitely think that the tools that we have today and the documentation we have today was a lot better and more uh, simplified for beginners than they were back when I started.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah. Have you played with the Swift Playgrounds app on the
Yes.
iPad? Yes.
Hmm.
Yeah, I think that's really the best tool to get started for sure.
Yeah.
You agree? Yeah.
Yes, I do. Yeah, I do. I think playgrounds on both the iPad and the Swift playgrounds on iPad and the playgrounds within Xcode are both very good tools.
Yes.
I actually use the Xcode playgrounds more
Okay.
while I build out projects. I'll take a piece of the project
Hmm.
and move it into the playground and build different prototypes of some sort of API or class that I want to design. I'll
Right.
test it out there, and then once I like what I have, I bring it back into my main project.
Gotcha. Nice. It's a good
Yeah.
practice. And
Hmm.
another thing is sometimes when like some people when they're getting started, they usually watch a ton of tutorials over and over and over and over again. How do you know when is the right time to actually build a project as opposed to just keep on watching tutorials?
Oh, that's a good question.
Yeah.
So I'm actually um, I'm not a visual learner, so I don't
Oh,
tend to watch video tutorials too much. I think they're very helpful.
okay. No, right.
I think I know a lot of people that really enjoy them.
Right.
I
Yeah,
just
I enjoy them. Yeah.
I haven't. Um, that's not something that I've used myself much, except for the WWDC videos.
Okay. Nice.
But I usually read those rather than watch the whole session.
Oh, wow.
Um,
Nice. Okay.
yeah, now that they have the transcripts, because then I can find exactly what I'm looking for. But
Gotcha.
but the tutorials that teach you how to, like the YouTube and the Stanford courses and things like that,
Yeah.
um, have been really helpful for a lot of people that can go back to the exact part where they got stuck, or if you need to learn a very specific thing, you have a lot of selections out there to
Right.
figure out that domain or that one topic. And I think it's really cool to see how other people code and
Right.
what their practices are and how they set up their environment, because we all have our own style. So it's cool to see how everyone else is working too.
Exactly. So you read books or documentation is your preference?
Yeah, a lot of books. Yeah, I actually my whole library for programming is all secondhand books.
Gotcha.
I've got a lot of textbooks that I've gotten off of eBay from
Gotcha.
secondhand stores or libraries or college universities that are selling old books. Um,
Nice.
yeah, I try to help those places that aren't making too much money. So
Nice.
yeah, I
Okay.
end up learning a lot from those books, and I go back to them all the time. So a lot of them are for interviewing preparation or
Right.
algorithms and data structures, and then some are specific for languages that are similar to Swift but make you think about how to solve
Mhm.
problems in a different way.
Yep. Oh, yeah. That's also another blocker for a lot of new learners is the algorithms and data structures.
Yes.
How do you recommend that to like strengthen your skills in that? Are you better off learning it in your test projects or like actually going to a site like Let's Code and
That's a really good question. I think it depends on the person, on the developer.
yes.
Something that's helped me with learning those concepts is building a separate app,
Okay.
like a demo app. I've got one that I continue to work on right now with Swift UI. It's a demo app that shows algorithms
Okay.
with animations. So
Oh wow.
it basically has a bar chart.
Right.
And so it starts with the small bars and goes to the very top bars on the right side.
That's cool.
And they're shuffled at random when you go to the screen. And then each, depending on which sort of sorting array or sorting algorithm you pick, it'll
Mhm.
sort them in that exact algorithm. So you get to see that animation.
Right.
Uh, and then there's some speeds because some of them are very slow and some of them are very fast. So you can see them at 100x or 1x or
Right.
5x. And then the
Nice.
same for other sorts of algorithms, not just sorting, but graph
So
types and things like that.
so what are the users' inputs to to make the graphs move around? Like what does
So, oh, so no, you can ask your question
oh
again.
no, yeah, like what are the inputs by the user
Hmm.
to make the interaction of the graphs?
Oh, okay. So one of the inputs right now, I think I'm using just locations. So they're just coordinates. Um, so you type in, you can either do a touch coordinate, like on the bottom of the screen, there's like a trackpad looking thing, and you just tap, put little dots, and then it makes the graph out of that. Or you could type in different coordinates if you want, or numbers, and then
Wow,
it'll put them. If you're doing a tree, it'll put the numbers in the right place on the binary tree, or if you're doing a graph, it'll put the coordinates on the right spot.
cool stuff. Yeah, definitely want
Yeah,
to check it out. Yeah,
and that allows you
yeah,
to also learn Swift UI and make a full-fledged app out of that framework,
yeah.
but also learn the data structures at the same time,
Mm,
or algorithms.
gotcha. Yeah, that's another question. What are your thoughts on Swift UI versus UI kits?
I love them both. I think they're both just as awesome. But I do, continuing with my intro about making sure the code doesn't work uh, if it's not supposed to. Swift UI is moving closer to that approach because there's subclassing is not a thing with structs.
Mm,
Since Swift UI is mostly value types, you need to make your views simplified and reusable. So you make, instead of making a profile view for your profile page,
mm,
you could break your profile view down into very small components like a user image view,
right.
user title view, and then you reuse those components in other places of the app,
Mm-hmm.
rather than making an entire UI for this specific page.
Right.
And I think that really allows for Swift UI to be um, powerful and make an app very quickly.
Gotcha.
So what
Nice.
I end up doing is I do make that profile view. I make the whole thing, and then once I realize that I can simplify it,
Mhm.
if I want to reuse another component, I bring that out into its own view, and then I keep doing that until I have a whole bunch of different fragments that I can use everywhere.
Exactly. Yeah. So
Yeah.
that's approach as well. Nice.
Hmm.
And last question is,
Yes.
where do you see iOS development in 5 years?
5 years.
Yeah.
Um, Oh, I don't know. There's definitely a lot. I mean, look at where we are now from 5 years ago. The
Right.
things that our phones can do today,
Right.
it's amazing.
Amazing.
So I wouldn't be able to guess where we'll be in 5 years.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a feeling like augmented reality is gonna pick up for sure.
Hmm.
That's my feeling. Cause like I feel like right now we've hit like a plateau of how much we can do, and then there's like another tool that users are gonna need. But we'll see.
Right.
Yeah, but it's
Yeah,
very exciting every year. Yeah.
definitely. Especially with the
Right.
iPad coming out, iPad Pro with the LiDAR
Oh
technology.
yes. Yep.
So
Yep.
yeah, I
Yeah.
could see some very cool things being introduced.
For sure. For sure. Yeah. Looking forward to it. Yeah, that's what gets me excited about iOS. So it's nice.
Yeah.
All right. So let's get to this next section.
Okay.
All right. Share my screen real quick. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah, perfect. So how is the memory managed in Swift?
So memory management in Swift, you've got reference types and value types. So
Yeah.
structs and enums and other types are first-class citizens, but they're also value types. So they're allocated on the stack.
Yeah.
And then you've got classes and reference types that are allocated on the heap.
Yes. Nice. And you have your automatic reference counting.
Yes, you do have automatic reference counting, which allows you to, um, if you do need memory, any owner of that memory pointer, if you're an object or a class, um, as long as an object has a reference to your object, you have one more reference or one more allocation. There's a retain, and then once that owner goes away, then you also go away because you're no longer retained.
That's right. Yep. And what is the single-toed pattern?
The singleton pattern is when you have an instance of any type that can only be one instance of that type. No
Yeah.
matter how you try to allocate that type, you will always get the exact same instance back.
Mhm. Perfect. And so would you say, when would you say is a good practice to use a single-toed pattern?
Um, for UI kit, for example, UI application is your singleton. It's the most important singleton of your entire app. You only have one app.
Yes.
So UI application has a shared um, property that allows you to access it singleton anywhere.
Gotcha. Nice. What is an extension and when is it used?
So an extension is similar to what categories were for Objective-C,
Yep.
but in Swift, an extension is um, code that extends the default implementation of any type. So for instance, we were talking earlier about how you can extend a protocol or you can extend a specific type to add more functionality. You can also extend any of those things with conditional um, options. You could say, extend this type when this other value is this, to
Right.
be very specific on where you can implement these changes.
Yes. And, how do you prefer to handle network multi-threading?
I would definitely use the Combine framework for this. URL session works with Combine out of the box, and it handles all asynchronous communications very, very well.
Nice.
And with Combine, you can fire off multiple data task operations at the same time and handle them when any events were to come back, whether that's an error or a success response. You could throttle certain network requests or filter the response to decode into a certain type from JSON. So very
Nice.
powerful tool.
Nice. And it uses observers and listeners in it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. I've been told it's very similar to Arc Swift. Is that true?
Similar in the sense that it's a reactive declarative asynchronous framework.
Yeah.
It's more similar to the reactive X spec, the open standard,
Mm-hmm.
which RX Swift is also a member of. So if you think of it just being a very an implementation of that standard, then yes, they are very similar.
Gotcha. Nice.
But RX Swift does have its own flavors of things that Combine does not have.
Gotcha. And it's only gonna get better as time goes
Yeah.
on. Yeah. All right. What is the difference between a struct and class?
So the difference, I kind of mentioned this earlier with the memory
Yep.
management, but the difference between a struct and the class is that a struct, the first difference is memory. So a struct is allocated on the stack and a class is allocated on the heap. And the
Yep.
second is semantics. So a struct
Mm-hmm.
has value type semantics, which means that if you reference a struct and change that implementation,
Right.
you're changing a copy of the original struct. You're not changing the original.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have a struct that's a cup of coffee and you take another variable from that same cup of coffee and you fill that coffee,
Yep.
you now have one struct that's an empty cup of coffee and one struct that's a full cup of coffee. But a class in the exact same example is if you had a class cup of coffee, if you have a variable of that first class and then you made a copy of it and filled it,
Yeah.
or not a reference to that original one and filled it, both cups would be filled because you'd only have one cup.
Gotcha. Nice. All right. What is a core data?
Core data is a object relational framework. It's a tool, it's a framework used within Apple's platforms to represent any sort of relational table, I guess. You can use SQLite for this.
Yes.
And there's a few other different persistence layers involved.
Nice. And what are the challenges of working with UI in iOS?
The challenges with working with UI, I think from the beginner's perspective would be learning how auto layout works.
Yes. Yep.
And the conflicts that are introduced with having adaptive layouts for different applications, different devices, and different screen sizes.
That's right. Yep. And today, do you have any challenges?
Today,
Yes.
I'm mostly active in Swift UI, so I don't have too many challenges there.
Okay.
But I think the biggest challenges for both Swift UI and UI Kit would be integrating both together and using both in the right context.
Gotcha. Nice. And how do you prefer to, when you're using UI Kit, how do you prefer to lay out your view? Is it programmatically or with storyboards?
I personally do everything programmatically, but storyboards are good to get a very quick app out there if you don't know too much about how to use UI Kit in a programmatic way. Storyboard's an excellent way to build your app.
Gotcha. Nice. And what is a keychain and when is it used?
Yes. So Keychain is a security feature that allows you to store user keys onto the device securely. And these keys can be passwords, they could be certificates, credentials, anything that you find that's important, private keys, I think I said certificates already, and provisioning profiles. So in iOS, you would use this to store anything that needs to be secure from the user's perspective or even the developer's perspective. And you can also access all of that content securely with the proper credentials.
Perfect. I think this is the last question. What is an extension? Oh, we already got this. Got this already. Yep, that's it.
Oh, awesome.
Perfect. So yeah, just got this. Can you see me?
Yes.
Perfect. Yeah, that was really great.
Oh, thank you.
For sure. And yeah, just to close it up, I want to say, do you have like any advice for somebody listening to us, watching us, and wants to get started tomorrow?
Yeah, I would definitely check out. There's plenty of resources online.
Yes.
If you really haven't learned anything for iOS related for building your own app, get started with Swift UI. There's some tutorials that are free on apple.com, developer.apple.com as well. And then if you are interested with UI Kit, there's plenty of resources out there. So my recommendation would be just going on the Twitter and meeting some people saying that you're new to iOS development and you want to learn more, and the community will definitely help you.
Awesome. And where can someone reach you?
Yeah, you can reach me online on any platform. My handle is always pxpgraphics at Twitter or LinkedIn or whatever you end up using. I'll be there at pxpgraphics.
Perfect. Yeah. Thank you so much, Faris. And I'm wishing you all the best in your
Oh, thanks,
future.
Arnold. I
All right.
appreciate you too. Thank you so much.
For sure.